So, friends, as Donald Trump continues to militarize the streets of America, we will continue to discuss and highlight how Trump is violating federal law. In part 3 of my extended conversation with law professor and military law expert Dan Maurer, we discuss, among other things, Donald Trump's violation of the Posse Comitatus Act, which essentially provides that military members cannot enforce civilian law. They can't police the streets of America. And we also talk about military members' non-negotiable duty to disobey unlawful orders. Because justice matters. Friends, here's part 3 of my conversation with law professor Dan Maurer. And so let's now transition to the third subject, which is the military being deployed to the streets of America and kind of, what the concerns are, where you think it's headed, another $64,000 question. But let's start with the basics. The Posse Comitatus Act, and in layman-friendly terms, what is that? And does it seem like, these military deployments by Donald Trump might be running afoul of that old statute?
Yeah. So make a quick point about your first comment about obeying orders. So before I was a JAG, I was a combat engineer officer. I deployed to the first year of the Iraq War as a platoon leader, led 30 soldiers as a 22-year-old. I didn't have a JAG with me, never saw a JAG. I'm sure they were there somewhere at the brigade or higher, but I never saw them down at the platoon level. And yet I knew, and my soldiers knew, that there were certain red lines. You don't need it spelled out. You don't need it. You don't have to have a copy of the UCMJ in your back pocket or a copy of the Geneva Convention in your back pocket to know that certain things are always going to be off limits. No matter how effective it makes your operation, how efficient it makes your operation, how good it makes you feel to be retributive, it doesn't matter. There are certain things that are not good and not warranted and not permitted, period. And you don't need a JAG to do that. Commanders are responsible for training their soldiers that. JAGs are there to assist, to aid, counsel, and provide subject matter expertise. But ultimately, commanders are on the hook for their soldiers' behavior. So that brings me to your follow-on question, which is domestic deployments. Okay, so here it gets kind of complicated, but not all that really. The easy first answer is we don't have a tradition of using our military as a police force domestically. Other countries do. Other friendly Western nations, quote unquote Western nations, do. Italy does, France does. They have a kind of a paramilitary police / organized armed forces that does that kind of stuff in their own domestic country. And there's no real issue with that. But they don't also have a tradition of the Bill of Rights. They have other concerns and constraints, but we, the United States, have a long historical tradition of not using the military as a domestic police force. It goes back to the founding. And the 10th Amendment, which basically leaves policing to community levels, the state level, county level, town level, city level, and not for the feds. And one of the reasons we put in the Declaration of Independence for pushing back against King George was the use of the British Army to police colonials, right? That was one of the reasons we said we are moving away, right? We are filing for divorce here. So we have the Third Amendment, which prohibits the use of civilian homes to house troops against their consent. We have specific laws that require congressional action to use the military domestically and abroad. It cannot just be at the whim of the president because he feels that way or because there seems to be a need. So the bottom line is there's a default. We don't use the military. That was codified into a law called the Posse Comitatus Act, the PCA, in the 1870s. Now, the history of that law is a bit convoluted and controversial because it was enacted at essentially the request of Southern governments to prevent the former Union, now federal troops, from policing Reconstruction. And they wanted the feds out of the South. which would allow the South then to discriminate and invoke or enact Jim Crow laws, etc. So the PCA has a tainted history, so to speak. But over time, it has come to mean we don't use the military to police our own citizens. There are only a few exceptions. It bars the use of the active military from policing. It does not bar the use of the National Guard from policing. So a state governor, like Governor Newsom in California, can use his National Guard to do law enforcement if the need be, and as long as state law doesn't prohibit it. Same thing in Ohio and Idaho and Maryland, wherever. They can do that. Traditionally, National Guards are used for two reasons. One is to respond to civil unrest, but usually in relation to natural disasters, floods, hurricanes, fires. The other one is to supplement and augment active duty forces going abroad to fight in combat. Not for traditional domestic law enforcement. That requires another power from the president. It requires the invocation of the Insurrection Act. That is another federal law. It goes back a long time. That is an explicit exception to Posse Comitatus. But it requires things like a rebellion. It requires an actual insurrection. It requires facts that show local law enforcement is overwhelmed. The courts don't work. Federal law and state law cannot be enforced unless the federal troops are put in harm's way and start executing police actions. That's a high bar to meet. And the last time the Insurrection Act was used in that way was 1992, ironically, in L.A. during the Rodney King riots. That was at the invitation of the California government, not against the governor's consent. So it's a really rare occasion when troops are used to use domestic police force. So the recent case in California, the federal judge issued an opinion that said the use of the troops in LA and elsewhere in California to support, quote unquote, support ICE raids was violating the PCA. We don't often have a court opinion where it says the government is violating the PCA. It's pretty rare. Usually the PCA is meant to prohibit things like the military investigating crimes and patrolling the streets and conducting arrests and searching and seizing property for evidence, the things that we expect cops to do and detectives to do. The PCA obviously prohibits that. That's not exactly what the military was doing, the Marines or the California Guard in LA. They were establishing perimeters around federal property. They were preventing protesters from getting close to ICE agents during raids. They were doing kind of traffic control. They were doing temporary detentions. But the court found that even that violated the PCA because there are only a few court decisions out there that talk about what it means. And they all kind of say that if you are directly involved in law enforcement, that's sufficient to violate the PCA. If your activities are pervasive within the civilian law enforcement of whatever thing you're doing, that's a PCA violation. If what you're doing is regulatory or proscriptive, prohibitory, like barring entrance to buildings or blocking access to streets or making detentions, those sorts of things do meet the definition of the PCA. And that's what the court found and said, you need to stop doing this. So we have a federal court saying the use of the military in Southern California was violating the Posse Comitatus Act. And now you have troops on the southern border that are ostensibly not preventing an invasion from Mexico. They're preventing the influx of illicit drugs and illegal immigrants. Also law enforcement. That's federal law, criminal law. And when troops are there to detain them and make arrests and hand them over to the state police or the FBI or ICE or the Customs and Border Patrol, they're still doing law enforcement. That's also a PCA violation. Now, we haven't had a court say that yet, but I suspect that it could or should. Now we have the use of JAGs, 600 JAGs will be, in one of my colleagues' words, deported to the DOJ, where they will serve as immigration judges, temporary immigration judges for up to 6 months. Problem is, immigration judging is the enforcement of law, the execution of law, plain and simple. We don't have a court opinion on that because it's never been tried before, because it's so obviously a PCA violation and so obviously not practical. You take 600 JAGs out, then they're not providing advice to commanders abroad or to units that are training to go abroad to potentially fight an actual armed conflict. They're not there to provide advice to commanders who are deployed domestically to make sure that they're not breaking the PCA. Instead, they've been transplanted over to the DOJ, where they're going to sit in immigration courts and rule on areas of law that they're not trained to rule on. They're not experienced in practicing it. And now you have the military, you have a military officer, a JAG officer, sitting in judgment of civilians. That looks like martial law. Not quite martial law, but it has an air about it. And it's certainly a step toward that. It's a niche area. It's a smallish area compared to the whole federal docket, obviously. But it's a lot of cases, thousands of immigration cases, thousands every year. And you're taking a significant percentage of the JAG Corps from all the services out of their normal duties, out of their normal operations, out of what they know, into this other area where they will be executing the law. And that violates the PCA.
Do you envision that somebody may bring suit challenging this sort of wholesale transfer of military JAGs into civilian law enforcement as immigration judges?
If I were representing a client in an immigration proceeding, I would raise that issue.
Yeah.
And it's not just a PCA violation. It's also probably a fairness and due process concern too, because you have military officers who are subordinate to the military chain of command, ultimately accountable to the president, who are now supposed to be neutral judges. Well, how many, tweets or X comments or Truth Social comments do you need before it's clear that the president wants you to rule in a certain way about certain kinds of immigration cases? The result is at least the appearance that these JAG immigration judges are not neutral, that they're biased, that they're going to rule in the way that the government wants them to rule, not as independent judges. That's a due process concern, a very serious one. So regardless of whether it violates the PCA, these individual litigants are at risk of having their rights trampled upon. Not because these JAGs are trying to do that. They're going to be acting in good faith. They're going to be trying to do their very best. And even if they personally don't think that they're beholden to the president in this regard, they don't think that they're being influenced in that regard, it doesn't really matter because the public appearance is that they are. And that can be enough to raise a significant concern. So if I were a litigant, I would be making that argument.
So let me just pull on one thread as we kind of head toward the end of our discussion. Let's just assume hypothetically that it is made clear throughout the military that a court has ruled in California that the military cannot be deployed to the streets of LA. That has been found by a federal court judge to violate the Posse Comitatus Act, and there is an order in place prohibiting it. I had a great extended conversation with Jeffrey DeWeese, also a retired Army JAG, and he's part of what's called the Orders Project under the National Institute of Military Justice, I believe. And, we were trying to puzzle through the implications of a court order prohibiting something, but then a military member being ordered to do that thing. This is purely hypothetical, and we're not here to give anybody legal advice, military members or otherwise. But what do you see a military member's responsibility to be if he or she is basically ordered to do something that there's clearly a federal judge's order prohibiting that thing from being done?
We'd like to presume that everyone knows the law, right? Ignorance of the law is no excuse. But the likelihood of an individual soldier or Marine on the streets who's been ordered by their platoon leader or company commander to go set up a blockade on some street intersection. It's very unlikely that that soldier is going to know about the court order or know what it means. That's not their job. That's not their expertise. They have other things to be worried about. So the likelihood of them knowing it is, I think, very small. So they're going to end up doing it, even though it's in violation of the law. Who should know? Well, the chain of command should know. If normal process is working, and I would hope that it would, as soon as that court decision came down and there's an order that says, okay, after this period of time, you will stop doing the following things, that presumably was communicated through the DOD and down the chain of command so that orders would not violate them, right? The planning for various operations would not put soldiers in positions where they're setting up perimeters and detaining individuals. It would presumably prevent them from doing those things. So let's say a commander signs off on an order that permits that anyway. That says, I'm ignoring the court order because it's on appeal and, I don't agree with it anyway, so we're going to keep doing what we're doing until President Trump tells me not to. A commander doing that would be following an unlawful order, right? And I think they're professionally derelict for doing that. Again, I hope that most would not do that. But we'd like to think that the commanders and the chain of command are well versed in this and will understand it. But they're usually, for things like this, are usually reliant on JAGs. Hey, boss, a court came out and said you can't do XYZ in Houston or New Orleans or Baltimore or Memphis or Chicago because they couldn't do it in LA. The judge there said you can't do it there. The same law applies here, so we can't do this order. You have JAGs advising commanders on that in the same way that JAGs would be advising commanders in Iraq or Afghanistan about what an international treaty prevents them from doing, or like the Geneva Conventions, right? International law of armed conflict. You can't do that. You might want to do this. It might make your job easier. We might get success faster, but we can't do it because the law prevents it. And so a commander hearing that, who wants to do the right thing and who has a duty to obey lawful orders and to not violate international law himself or herself, is going to adjust their planning accordingly. They're not going to give an order that would violate that law. They're going to modify their plans so that they can avoid violating the law. But that depends a lot on having those JAGs there to provide that subject matter expertise, that counseling. And I'm not convinced, I'm quite skeptical that as we continue along this path, that JAGs will be present down the chain of command with those units that are deploying that can help commanders avoid those mistakes. Inadvertent violations of the PCA can help train soldiers to know, hey, when you hear this kind of order, that doesn't comply. So push back. But if JAGs aren't there, who's going to provide that training? Who's going to provide that advice? No one. And we know from Secretary Hegseth's very public comments about JAGs, we know how he feels about JAGs. He views them as blockades, blockages, roadblocks, whatever you want to use, or worse words to use to describe JAGs, as impediments to the warrior ethos, however that's defined, however he defines it, and mission accomplishment. He has a very, very negative view on the role that JAGs play to legitimize military operations. And the more and more that our operations, whether they're in LA or Memphis or in the Caribbean or in a courtroom, the more and more that they skirt and cross that line into illegality, the more we delegitimize our own military. And the more it appears to be partisan and political, and politicized. And that reduces, inevitably, the American people's trust in the military, which, at least for the last few decades, has benefited from a very high public trust, regardless of political persuasion. And now, when you see that breaching, that violation of the law over and over and over again, you can't help but view it as they're succumbing to partisan pressure. They're not pushing back.
And delegitimizing the military, this seems to be a theme because it looks like all of our institutions of government are being delegitimized in the way they're being hollowed out, in the way they're being staffed by people who, have vowed to shutter the very organizations they're put in charge of. And it does seem like there is this effort to undermine the public's confidence in all institutions of government. And I know there are experts on autocracy who say, well, that is the playbook, because then the only strong man, the only, strong figure remaining is the dictator or the autocrat. I don't want to think that's what is at play here, but, it's hard to ignore the facts. So let me ask you one last question, Dan, because this is heavy and there's not a lot of optimism, I think, given what we are experiencing. What leaves you hopeful that the military is going to stay strong and that our, not to be hyperbolic, our republic will survive?
Well, I think I do remain on balance optimistic, but it's a long-term optimism. I think we're gonna continue to sink down lower and lower, and see more and more normalization of what we could not conceive of a year ago or 5 years ago. And whether it's, to use your words, hollowing out of the government, delegitimizing public services like the military, we're going to continue to see that escalate to a point where I hope and I think it will cross some line that spurs so much resistance, so much public resistance in the narrative, so much negative public messaging, regardless of party, that we have to turn back a little bit. That you get to a point where, not to use a alcoholic kind of analogy, but you hit rock bottom. You have to hit that rock bottom before you can start going back, and you have to recognize that you hit rock bottom before you progress, accepting it and willing to change, right? The American public has to come to understand not just one side of it, but all of it. Needs to understand just how far we've come, how far we've come toward autocracy, how far we are along that path, and to admit that, and to say we don't want that. We can't go to that. We can't accept that. Regardless of whether you agree with some of the policy objectives and aims, there are certain things that we have to say no to, like extrajudicial killings, cutting out all of due process, blanket lying to the American public. You can't have a functioning community of any size if the government lies to its people and the people themselves accept it. They know it's happening and they accept it. So, in my view, I think and I hope that we will get to a point where we've just had enough and we start to push back. The resistance becomes real in the sense of we don't tolerate it anymore. We just don't. And there's some indications of that here and there sporadically. But it needs to be more consistent and it needs to be louder. Yeah. And I'm hopeful that the pendulum will swing back away from autocracy, from falsehoods, from denigrating expertise in science, from rejecting the rule of law. It's not sustainable. It's just not. And I think most people will eventually realize that it's not sustainable. And I don't think that Trump is repeatable. I think he's an outlier, and I hope he's an outlier. And I think once he is gone, some sense of normalcy will return. It won't look the way it did before, but it'll inch its way back.
Yeah, and you sort of concluded on a phrase that I have been using for a very long time, generally in relation to the rule of law, what I see at the Department of Justice, my beloved home for decades. after I was an Army JAG. And what I have been saying is what Trump is doing, the way he's governing, or perhaps more precisely ruling over the American people, is not sustainable. You know, when we see not just the brain drain, but the ethics drain from the Department of Justice, people who are either being unlawfully terminated or they're self-selecting. And I don't blame them. I don't call that obeying in advance. I have so many friends and colleagues who have said, I can't work for this administration, given that they're sending DOJ lawyers in to court to lie to judges about the true circumstances of, among other things, deportations. I can't be part of that. But the result is there is a brain drain and an ethics drain from the Department of Justice that will leave the American people adrift on the law enforcement front. So this is not sustainable. And Dan, even if the only hope we have is that we're going to hit rock bottom, I mean, at least that is some hope that once we're there, we recognize the need to dig ourselves out. And I think, look, we were a people who defied kings before in our nation's history, and we need to be a people who defy kings again. So let me ask you, is there some place people can find your work, your writing, your commentary? Because the depth of knowledge on these military-related issues, I think, is invaluable for people to hear so they can understand what's really going on. Are you on some social media platforms where people can find you?
I wouldn't recommend to anybody pulling out my books and my law journal articles because they'll put you to sleep. So unless you're an academic or court, please don't bother. But I have written extensively for places like Lawfare and Just Security, which are curated online blogs that focus on national security and legal issues, the intersection between those two things. I have a piece coming out probably next week in Lawfare. So just Google my name and Lawfare, and you'll find lots of stuff. There's another Maurer on there, not related, Tim. So just look for Dan Maurer Lawfare or Just Security. I have some pieces there too. So I probably on average, every couple of weeks or couple of months, I'm posting something there. I post infrequently on Blue Sky, but I have a fairly active LinkedIn messaging campaign going on. So you can find me there too. And I post probably daily or every other day via LinkedIn.
Yeah, so let me urge people to find Dan on LinkedIn, because I think that's where I found him. And LinkedIn, I think, has exploded in popularity, particularly around the legal issues of the day, the military issues of the day. It has gone from kind of a job search website to a site that has really robust discussions and great information about what's going on in the federal government. So, and I didn't know if you were on Substack or not.
I am. I neglected to say that because it's relatively new for me. But yeah, I have a Substack. It's called Politics by Other Means. You can look that up or just look up my name, and I post there. I have a free account as well as some paid stuff.
Great. And I will put links to all of the places where you can find Dan in the description for this video. So I greatly appreciate your depth of knowledge and the layman-friendly way that you explain these issues. And maybe over time we'll circle back and periodically try to update folks on the status of what Trump is trying to do with, our nation's military. So thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Glenn. Appreciate it.